Mark 6. Glory Passing Through Stormy Seas. The morning rain streaks across the high, arched glass windows of the university lecture hall as a distant rumble of thunder vibrates the heavy hanging lights. Inside the wood-paneled seminar room, 4 figures gather around a large table. Pastor Nathan at the head, his notes spread before him. Rabbi Jonathan, beside him, adjusting his glasses. Ethan, pencil already tapping rhythmically against the desk. And Chloe, chin resting in her hands as she studies the chalkboard. Look at the emotional collapse built right into the architecture of this opening block. Jesus leaves the explosive restorations of chapter 5, where power is literally leaking out of his clothes, and walks directly into the freezing, cynical draft of his own hometown, his Patras. It's a deliberate suffocating of narrative momentum, where the familiar faces he grew up with use his ordinary blue-collar lineage as a weapon of minimization, whispering about the carpenter's son until their collective offense, this suffocating escandalizanto, hardens into a wall of absolute apathy. Pastor Nathan leans forward, his voice dropping into a tense, resonant register. They locked the door from the inside because they couldn't reconcile the boy who worked the timber with the cosmic dynamis that just commanded the dead to rise. Their absolute unbelief, this paralyzing apistia, acts as a structural boundary that binds his hands, forcing the architect of the universe to marvel at the sheer deadness of their posture before he heals a mere handful of sick individuals on his way out the gate. Rabbi Jonathan notes the cultural gravity with a sharp nod, adjusting his notes. The synagogue in Nazareth became an institutional tomb because they demanded he fit into their neat, localized lineage, failing to see that the prophet is without honor precisely where people believe familiarity equals ownership. It is the ultimate dead zone, a complete subversion of the radical faith we saw on the eastern shores. Ethan taps his pencil rhythmically against the wooden desk, calculating the structural response. So Jesus doesn't waste energy trying to fix a closed loop. He immediately executes a radical tactical shift by decentralizing the entire operation, breaking the administrative bottleneck of Nazareth by calling the 12, dividing them into pairs, and multiplying his sovereign authority right into the dirt roads. The rain beats harder against the high windows, creating a steady, rhythmic background hiss that mirrors the sudden kinetic movement of the text. Ethan continues without a pause, his voice cutting through the damp air of the lecture hall. He pushes them out 2 by 2 with an intentional logistical leanness. No extra tunic, no bread, no money in their belts, forcing them into a position of total, radical dependence, where they carry nothing but sandals and a staff to prove that the authority they wield over unclean spirits is completely separate from earthly resources. Chloe shifts her focus, her fingers tracing the structural transition on her page. It's a breathtaking contrast. While Nazareth sits in a static, cynical freeze frame, the pairs of disciples are hitting the highways, their feet flying across the landscape as they cast out demons and anoint the sick, turning a localized rejection into an urgent, distributed explosion of the kingdom. Pastor Nathan shifts his weight, the leather of his chair creaking softly in the quiet room. But right in the middle of this missionary firestorm, the narrative center drops like a lead weight when the news of John the Baptist's execution reaches them. The text forces us to look into the dark, predatory banquet room of Herod Antipas, a room choked with narcissistic bloodlust, drunken oaths, and a prophet's head served on a platter to satisfy an elite political ego. Rabbi Jonathan lets out a slow breath, his eyes darkening as he speaks. That royal feast of death is the ultimate literary foil to what Jesus does next, when he tries to pull his exhausted disciples into a desolate, quiet place to privately process the raw grief of his cousin's murder. A desperate running multitude from every city recognizes him and completely cuts off his retreat, violently invading his solitude. Chloe leans in, her voice catching with emotional resonance. Any ordinary human leader would have pulled the security lines tight or walked away in anger, but Jesus looks out at that chaotic, intrusive sea of faces and allows his personal grief to be entirely swallowed up by a massive wave of gut-wrenching divine compassion. A sharp flash of lightning momentarily illuminates the stone arches of the hall, followed immediately by a heavy roll of thunder that underscores the shifting cosmic stakes. Pastor Nathan lifts his hands, tying the wilderness imagery back to the ancient scrolls. He sees them as sheep without a shepherd, a direct echo of Ezekiel's ancient indictment against the corrupt leaders of Israel, and he instantly transforms that barren wasteland into a new exodus, ordering the thousands to sit down in ordered companies on the green grass. Ethan tracks the physical distribution with intense precision. The math of that wilderness table defies every mechanical system. He takes 5 loaves and 2 fish, breaks them under the open sky, and continuously passes them through the hands of the 12 until 5,000 families are completely gorged, leaving 12 baskets overflowing with broken fragments to prove that his table offers life without end, completely shattering the memory of Herod's predatory feast. Chloe looks up, her eyes wide as she bridges the transition to the dark water. But the crowd doesn't understand the nature of the bread, so Jesus immediately forces the disciples back into the boat, sending them out into the blackness of the Sea of Galilee, while he ascends the mountain alone to pray in the dead of night. Rabbi Jonathan points to the storm vector on the grid. By the fourth watch of the night, the wind is screaming, and the disciples are completely trapped on the open water, their muscles tearing as they strain helplessly at the oars against an adversarial sea that wants to swallow them whole. Pastor Nathan's voice rises slightly, matching the intensity of the storm. Out of the darkness, Jesus steps directly onto the chaotic surface of the primeval deep, literally trampling the wild waves as a living manifestation of Job's declaration that only the Creator walks upon the recess of the sea. The text says he meant to pass them by, using that technical language of perikomai to signal an unshielded divine glory pass, the exact same way Yahweh passed before Moses at the Rock of Sinai. The ambient hum of the lecture hall seems to contract, drawing every voice into a tight, high-focus circle as the final bookend approaches. Chloe shivers slightly, her eyes wide as she recreates the psychological panic of the boat. They see a figure striding across the abyss and they scream out in absolute terror, convinced they are looking at a death-dealing phantom, a phantasma, because their minds are completely hardened and locked. They couldn't see that the hand that multiplied the bread on the grass is the same sovereign hand that commands the wind and the water. Pastor Nathan speaks the climactic phrase with absolute weight. Jesus cuts right through their terror with the timeless declaration of the burning bush, commanding them to take courage because ego eimi, I am, is here. And the very moment his feet touch the wood of the boat, the howling wind instantly drops into a dead calm, leaving them paralyzed with an overwhelming, bone-crushing fear of his true identity. Ethan watches the narrative arc sweep back toward the shore as the boat finally grinds its hull into the sand of Gennesaret. The chiasm, the mirrored literary structure, snaps shut right here at the water's edge, because the moment he steps out onto the beach, the entire environment flips into a high-energy grid of active, relentless faith that completely reverses the deadness of Nazareth. Rabbi Jonathan smiles faintly, tracing the rapid movement of the crowd. There is absolutely no skepticism here, no secondary cross-examination of his lineage, and no localized offense taken. The people recognize him instantly, running through the entire countryside and packing the public marketplaces with sick individuals lying on mats. Chloe ends the study, her voice rising with an explosive, fluid energy that mirrors the text. They don't even ask for a formal sermon or a laying on of hands. They simply beg to touch the very fringe, the metallic edge or craspedon of his outer garment, and as the active fire of faith collides with his unshielded cosmic authority, the floodgates are ripped wide open, and every single person who touches him is made perfectly whole.